If President Joe Biden resigned, died, or was for any other reason unable to fulfill his presidential duties, Vice President Kamala Harris would take his place. She would become the 47th President of the United States and would serve out a partial term consisting of the remaining years or months of Biden's term. If both Biden and Harris were unable to serve, such as in the case of a double assassination, Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy would assume office as acting president. Between McCarthy becoming Speaker and Nancy Pelosi leaving the position, there was a 3-day gap when the position was vacant. Had something happened to Biden and Harris during these 3 days, the acting presidency would have passed to President pro tempore of the Senate, Democrat Patty Murray. If all 4 of these offices were vacant at the same time, the role of acting president would fall on Joe Biden's Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. The line of succession then follows with other members of Joe Biden's cabinet. After Blinken is Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, then Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, and the list continues in order of when the cabinet position was established. For example, Secretary of the Interior was established in 1849, thus falls under the earlier cabinet positions established in 1789. Secretary of Homeland Security was only established in 2003, thus falls lowest on the list. However, Alejandro Mayorkas, Joe Biden's Secretary of Homeland Security, isn't actually part of the presidential line of succession, as he was not born a United States citizen, but instead a citizen of Cuba. There are very few restrictions on who the president can appoint to his cabinet. They don't have to be a natural-born citizen or over 35, but both are requirements for the presidency. Biden's Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm, was also not born as a United States citizen. Technically, the Speaker of the House or the President pro tempore of the Senate might also not meet the requirements. Individuals that don't meet these requirements are simply skipped over and not included in the line of succession. In summary, the line of succession is first the Vice President, second the Speaker of the House, and third the President pro tempore of the Senate, and then the members of the President's cabinet. This is the current order. The original order, as according to the Succession Act of 1792, was first the Vice President, second the President pro tempore of the Senate, and third the Speaker of the House. The President's cabinet wasn't originally included. That changed in 1886. Both the President pro temp and the Speaker were removed from the line of succession, and instead, the cabinet members were added. Under these rules, the line of succession would go directly from Harris to Secretary of State Blinken. The current order of succession was established in 1947, adding the President pro temp and the Speaker back to the list, though in reverse order, directly after the Vice President and then followed by the President's cabinet. In recent years, a new question has emerged. What if every office in the line of succession is vacant at the same time? This might be possible in the case of a large-scale terrorist attack, like on September 11, 2001, a bioweapon attack, or a nuclear attack. This has been accounted for with the concept of the designated survivor. During events when all members of the line of succession are present or relatively close in proximity, one person in the line of succession stays at a secret location. For example, if a terrorist attack occurred while the president was giving the State of the Union address, the designated survivor would be safe and thus would become acting president. In this scenario, it's possible that Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg, though 14th in line, could act as president. If no one in the line of succession was able to serve, it's unclear what would happen. But this is far from a pressing question. In over 230 years of presidential history, no one in line beyond the vice president has ever been called upon. The vice president has ascended to the presidency intra-term 9 times. 8 times it was due to the president's death, and once because of the president's resignation. For 52 years, from first President George Washington to 8th President Martin Van Buren, every president lived out his term. That changed on April 4, 1841, when 9th President William Henry Harrison died only a month into his term. It's taken for granted today that when a president dies, the vice president assumes office, becomes the next president, and assumes all the titles and powers of his predecessor. But when Harrison died, the vice president's role became controversial. Many argued that the vice president shouldn't actually become president, but should only be acting president. He would act as a caretaker of the office. A special election would be held. The new president and vice president would then begin a new 4-year term. However, Harrison's vice president, John Tyler, saw things differently. He insisted that he didn't just become acting president, but became the official 10th president and would serve out a term consisting of the time remaining in Harrison's term. Had a man less assertive, confident, and disagreeable been in Tyler's place, United States history would look very different. Despite the controversial takeover, Tyler set a precedent. 9 years later, when another president died, Zachary Taylor, there was little question about his vice president, Millard Fillmore, ascending to the presidency. Though no one further down the line of succession has ever been called upon, it was extremely close to happening more than once, most notably on April 14, 1865. That night, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, but his murder was just part of a larger conspiracy that also included killing Vice President Andrew Johnson. Johnson's would-be assassin, George Atzerodt, had actually booked a room in the same hotel where Johnson was staying, and if it weren't for Atzerodt's cowardice, Johnson would have been assassinated the same night as Lincoln. The next in line was Republican Lafayette S. Foster, President pro tempore of the Senate. A special election would have been held to elect Lincoln's successor. From April until then, Foster would have acted as president. The winner of that election would become the 17th president, and he would serve out a full 4 years, not merely the remainder of Lincoln's term. It's very likely that had this special election been held, Republicans would have nominated Ulysses S. Grant, and considering his popularity, he would have won, thus beginning his term in 1866. All of this might beg the question, what actually is the acting president? It's an idea that had been murky for over a century before it was actually defined, and even today, it remains somewhat unclear. At first, it simply meant, or seemed to mean, someone who temporarily held the powers of the president in case of the president's death. The vice president, president pro tempore of the Senate, or the Speaker of the House would act as president if needed until a special election could be held. As mentioned, this changed when John Tyler determined that he was not merely the acting president. At least, it changed for the vice president. It's still unclear what happens if someone lower in the line of succession assumes office. Constitutional lawyer M. Miller Baker said, quote, "The succession clause originally contemplated that the vice president would be the acting president. That's been changed. The 25th Amendment constitutionalized the vice president becoming the president, but as far as statutory successors, they only become acting president. Originally, the acting president would only hold power until a special election. The current rules, however, no longer mention a special election. Without a special election, if Kevin McCarthy were to become acting president, he would presumably do so until the end of Biden's term. It's unclear how this would be different from an actual presidency. M. Miller Baker does point out that if someone such as Secretary of State were to become acting president, they could simply follow John Tyler's precedent and declare themselves the new president. This might all depend on who that individual was and the current power structure in Washington. These issues remain heavily debated, and some might even disagree with the interpretations presented in this video. In any case, this also presents a unique scenario in which someone with radically different policies could take over the presidency without an election. Unlike with the vice president or the cabinet members, the president has nothing to do with the selection of Speaker of the House or President pro tempore of the Senate. The Speaker is elected by a majority vote in the House of Representatives, and the President pro temp a majority vote in the Senate. These positions might be held by people of the same party as the president, as is the case with the current pro temp of the Senate, but it's no guarantee. Currently, Kevin McCarthy is the Speaker of the House and the only Republican in the line of succession. A McCarthy presidency would likely mark a drastic flip in policies. The passage of power from president to vice president gives greater confidence and consistency. When James A. Garfield died, his vice president, Chester A. Arthur, honored his wishes and governed in a similar way. Harry S. Truman took over for Franklin D. Roosevelt, and while he wasn't as effective, many of his policies were similar. But consistency isn't always guaranteed. For one, there's no reason a president and vice president couldn't be from different parties. Even within the same party, a president and vice president can be worlds apart. Generally, presidential candidates pick their running mate on the basis of their differences. John F. Kennedy, a Northern liberal Democrat, picked Lyndon B. Johnson, a Southern, more conservative Democrat. Barack Obama, young, with only 3 years in the Senate, picked 65-year-old Joe Biden, who'd been a senator for 35 years. Donald Trump, loud, bombastic, and unconventional, picked the quiet and conventional Mike Pence. The greatest upsets and unpredictability in the executive office have come from vice presidents taking over, notable examples being John Tyler, Andrew Johnson, and Theodore Roosevelt. Had these men only served as acting president until the following November, it's very likely their parties would have simply nominated other candidates, and they would have never become president in their own right. These upsets have led to some of the most radical and unexpected shifts in United States politics, but some people don't like this system. Joe Biden voters probably wouldn't be eager to see his term carried out by Kevin McCarthy, nor Donald Trump voters to see Democrat Nancy Pelosi take his place. It's been a controversial issue since the line of succession was first addressed back in George Washington's presidency. While most of Washington's cabinet were Federalist, Thomas Jefferson, his Secretary of State, was not. Federalists were so reviled at the possibility of Jefferson assuming office in the advent of Washington and Adams' death that the Secretary of State wasn't included in the original line of succession. But for some, it isn't merely an issue of partisan politics. Later, when cabinet members were added to the line of succession, some argued that since cabinet members are chosen by the president can essentially choose his successors. One of the people who didn't like this was Harry S. Truman. Truman pushed for the 1947 Act, which once again added the Speaker and President pro temp. However, some people still argue that the Speaker has no right to the presidency, as while he is elected, he's elected by the House of Representatives, and he's elected Speaker, not President. Perhaps a less controversial and more universal concern is the President pro tempore being third in line. The job of President pro temp is to preside over the Senate when the Vice President isn't available. In practice, it's mainly a ceremonial role, and customarily, it's held by the most senior member of the majority party. Naturally, this means the President pro temp is old. Patty Murray was only 42 when she first entered the Senate, but when she became President pro temp, she was 71. Prior to her, it was Patrick Leahy, who was 82 when he left. Prior to him, it was 87-year-old Chuck Grassley. Oldest of all, however, was Strom Thurmond. Thurmond served in the role at 3 different points in his 48 years as senator. The last time he did, from January to June 2001, he was 98. He died 2 years later at 100. It's also worth noting that the only time someone served in the role of president pro tempore and later as president was with John Tyler. And Tyler isn't even a prime example, as when he served as pro temp, he was much younger than most who do so today. It might seem over the top to be concerned about the viability of the president pro tempore of the Senate or the Speaker of the House or the Secretary of State, considering their third, fourth, or fifth in the line of succession. However, this hasn't always been the case. In 1965, the 25th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified. This allowed for the president to fill intra-term vacancies in the vice presidency. Prior to this, if the vice presidency was vacant for any reason, the president nor anyone else had the power to fill it. This is the way things were for 176 years. Any time a president died, the vice president ascended to the presidency and left the vice presidency vacant. If the vice president resigned, it was vacant, and it was vacant when the vice president died. Some of these vacancies were relatively irrelevant, such as when William Howard Taft's vice president, James S. Sherman, died. He died only days before Election Day, meaning the office only stayed vacant from November to March and during Taft's lame duck period. But this wasn't usually the case. Grover Cleveland's vice president, Thomas A. Hendricks, died just 8 months into his vice presidential term. Franklin Pierce's vice president, William Rufus King, died after only a month. And John Tyler served without a vice president longer than any other president. William Henry Harrison died so soon into his term that Tyler practically served out a full presidential term without a vice president. On 16 different occasions, the vice presidency has been left vacant, and cumulatively, that adds up to 38 years. The biggest concern used to be in regards to vacancies in the Speaker or President pro tempore positions. What if the president died when there was no vice president, and in the window of time between the old president pro tempore of the Senate stepping down and the new one being elected? This was the concern when Thomas A. Hendricks died, and why the Succession Act of 1886 was passed the following year, which placed cabinet members in the line of succession. Since the 25th Amendment passed, its section allowing for the president to fill vice presidential vacancies has only been evoked 2 times. In 1973, Richard Nixon's vice president Spiro Agnew resigned. Nixon then nominated House Minority Leader Gerald Ford, who was then confirmed by a vote in both houses of Congress. After Nixon resigned the following year, Ford became president and nominated his own vice president, Nelson Rockefeller. If the amendment had never passed, Richard Nixon would have resigned without being able to nominate a new vice president. Speaker of the House and Democrat Carl Albert would have become the acting president. Since the passage of power from Nixon to Ford, there have only been minor issues of presidential succession. No president has died or resigned since 1974, nor has any vice president. However, on 4 occasions, the vice president did briefly step into the role of acting president. Section 3 of the 25th Amendment allows for the president to temporarily transfer power to the vice president. In practice, this has been done when the president is undergoing surgery. For about 8 hours, George Bush served as acting president while Ronald Reagan underwent surgery for colon cancer. Dick Cheney served as acting president twice while George W. Bush had a colonoscopy, both times for about 2 hours. And for about 85 minutes, Kamala Harris served as acting president during Joe Biden's colonoscopy. This is mainly done in case a major executive decision needs to be made while the president is under anesthesia. In October of 2020, Donald Trump became ill with COVID-19. Some speculated that he would allow Vice President Mike Pence to act as president until he recovered. This never happened, but it's possible future presidents will temporarily transmit power to the vice president in such circumstances. In 2001, the September 11th terrorist attacks renewed concerns about the line of succession, but over the course of 20 years, these concerns have died down. There are still debates about the line of succession, its vagueness in some areas, its constitutionality in others, but these are currently not treated as pressing issues. If history is any indicator, these issues may only be addressed when or if they ever need to be, and no sooner. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing and donating on Patreon. Donations from $2 to $15 a month help towards more frequent uploads. Patreon link in the description below.